he could have worded this, like you said, he could have simply said, don't use the name of the Lord. There you go. Nothing to worry about. You know, you can't misuse it if you can't use it. So, but he says, do not swear falsely by my name. Not necessarily don't swear by my name.
Yeah. Yeah, we have to take it serious. It's a weighty thing. So I mean, if you're not a thoughtful person, then maybe you should just have a prohibition against using God's name, if you're not going to be thoughtful about it. But what this is calling us to is a thoughtful, mindful use of God's name. Welcome to Biblocus, where the Bible intersects with your life. I'm Timothy.
And I'm Caleb.
And you're listening to Bible Discussions, the forum where we explore biblical topics that are relevant to your life. Today, we're continuing our series on the 10 Commandments. And this episode, we're going to look at the third commandment, which we are calling, do not use the Lord's name in vain. I know that's, as we've talked about, not everybody has the same order, but that's where we are. Now, this may be the most poorly understood of the 10 Commandments because it's been taken as just a general prohibition against saying the word God. For instance, people say, oh my God, or God bless you even. People are like, oh, yeah, you can't say that because you're using the name God. And that's not exactly what the purpose of this commandment is, but we're going to look at it. Could include those things depending on how you say them.
He could have simply said, do not use the Lord's name, if that was what he wanted.
Yeah.
But he says in vain, so don't use it in a certain way.
Yeah, because common phrases like this, oh my God, or God bless you, are commonly used throughout the Bible, in Psalms and other things that talk about God. So we're going to try to put all this in context, and we're going to begin by reading this command from the NIV to try to start figuring it out. So in Exodus 20, verse 7, it says, you shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Now, first, I want to talk about something we've never talked about yet that I can remember on Biblocus is the tetragrammaton, which is the 4 letters it means. And in Hebrew, those 4 letters are transliterated into English as YHWH.
Okay. Yeah, so we're doing the Decalogue, the 10 words, and now we're breaking it down into just the 4 letters.
yeah, the tetragrammaton. Yeah. All right, so now
there's no vowels in written ancient Hebrew.
That's true.
Yeah, so it should just YHWH.
And then that kind of gets to why we have this problem because later when Hebrew was being written with vowel pointings, they never put the vowel pointings onto the tetragrammaton presumably because they didn't want anybody to know how it was pronounced, or they'd already forgotten how it was pronounced. But they basically, because of this general idea, you never say the name of the Lord, don't put the vowel pointings on there. But then, so you just had the 4 consonants essentially. Now, when you got further down in history, like the Masoretic text. Okay, they decided to put vowel pointings on it. They used the vowel pointings from the word Adonai, and so that's where you ended up with vowel pointings above it. But it was supposed to be a reminder, say Adonai when you read this, because that way, they would replace, like instead of saying YHWH or whatever, they would replace it with Adonai, or some Jews would replace it with the word Hashem, which means the name. So you'd either read the name.
Adonai means the Lord, by the way.
Yes.
Like just like in English, in this context, we hear the Lord and we just automatically think of God. But that actually has a prior meaning in English, right? Like a nobleman or something, a master.
Oh, yeah. We use the word Lord in a lot of different ways, right? And so, but in this case, Adonai was used as to say the Lord instead of using his proper name that he had revealed to them. And so we're going to look at why all that might have developed as we look at the different ways you could misuse God's name, which we already talked about. One is just a general prohibition against the use of his name, which is kind of where this came from. But yeah, that was kind of the whole purpose of deleting the pointings in the first place, was so nobody could ever know or figure out what it was. And so they were successful in that regard.
Yeah.
But
Thanks a lot.
yeah. So the second thing I want to talk about is how if you take any passage out of context, you're going to have a hard time getting the proper understanding of it. And this is a good passage for that. And I purposefully started at verse 7. You know, the last couple episodes, I've been starting back at verse 1 every time and reading all the way up to the command of that week. Well, I didn't do that this week because taking it out of context served my purposes, which is not how you're never supposed to interpret the Bible, because we were talking about how it just became a general prohibition about not using God's name at all. So if you go back, though, and read the first two verses of Exodus 20, which we've done in the past, I'll read right now. It says, "And God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery." Now notice the tetragrammaton is being used in verse 2. How do I know that? Well, because I'll leave it up there for you to look at. So whenever you see Lord in small caps, so all of those capitals are small caps. In the L is a capitalized small cap. Mm-hmm. And then, then the ORD is in small caps. That's what the NIV uses and many other translations use to represent the tetragrammaton. So you know that you're reading it Lord, just like the intention we talked about a minute ago was with the Masoretes when they wrote the Masoretic text. So now the English versions are putting Lord. Now some English versions put Yahweh in there, and of course older English ones like the KJV have Jehovah in there, and some even use Jehovah in the New Testament where the word wasn't even being used, but anyway, so that's where you have like the divine name and you see those small caps. So that educates you when you're reading. You say, oh, that's the tetragrammaton if I was reading in Hebrew. So that's kind of a helpful thing. So this is the preamble to the commands. Yeah.
Right. So God is prefacing all the commands with his own name, just like when he calls Moses, right, to go to the Israelites, and Moses says, "Who do I tell them sent me? I am has sent me to you." That's what you're to tell them.
Yeah.
And so he prefaces the commands in the same way.
Because it's authoritative, right? It's not Moses' words, it's God's words. And that's what makes Moses a prophet, God speaking through Moses. So no man should be able to just speak for God. I think that's so, but one cool thing about like this preface, you can see God's name being used right in the Ten Commandments, not just in the command that says, don't ever say this. It's in earlier in the preface here, in this preamble, saying like, I'm the Lord your God, using the divine name right there. So there are proper uses for the divine name.
So how does God use it?
Right, he's using it to recount the history of God with his people. So he's calling himself by name and saying, this is what we did together, right? And so...
Right. And this happens a lot in various ways. He'll often say, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of your fathers. It's calling into memory the whole context.
Yeah, and he's modeling the Shema for us. The proper use of his name here is when we tell the other generations, the next generation, about what happened, in previous generations, in the history we have with God. It's a history lesson. That's what we're supposed to do when we read the Shema in Deuteronomy 6, and as we've emphasized just about every week in our podcast, is teach the next generation about God and about the honor of his name, right? Because we could positively restate this commandment. Like
that's what we've been doing so far. They're all, or not all, but a lot of them are listed as a negative, thou shalt not do this. But they're defending a principle, so you could also affirm it in a positive way. Yeah,
so like honor the name of the Lord, or bring honor to the name of the Lord, or something like that. Consider the Lord's Prayer in this regard, right?
Yeah.
Jesus starts it out like, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name.
Yeah. Unless you're on Jeopardy, and nobody knows that.
That's right. I forgot about that. So
that's the state that we're in as our society now. They don't even know that his name is to be holy.
Yeah, yeah. And, part of that's the archaic word hallowed, we don't use as much. But yeah, like bring honor to his name. And then the third thing I wanted to talk about with relationship to just the command itself is this idea of don't use the Lord's name in vain, or as the NIV said, do not misuse the name. And so what's the Hebrew word behind that? Because we have some different interpretations that are, captured in our English Bibles over the centuries here. And so the Hebrew word is shav, which has a range of meanings, but like it's from a root that means to desolate, and as an adverb like desolating or whatever. But like it's or useless or false or vain, like we've heard in the King James. So like it's only used 4 places in the Pentateuch, and 2 of them are in Exodus. This one here in this command, and then if you jump down to chapter 23, verse 1, it talks about another command, which is do not spread false reports, which is very similar to don't bear false witness. Although in Exodus, there's a different word used there for false. But this word also means false. So it's used in do not spread false reports in Exodus 23. And it's used twice in Deuteronomy for the 10 Commandments, in which this command, don't misuse the Lord's name or don't use it in vain. It's this word shav. And then later in the commandment about bearing false witness, it uses the word shav also in Deuteronomy. So there's like not used very much in the Pentateuch itself. But the idea is always the same about something being false or something being used frivolously, like this command. So I like the idea of this desolating root meaning of the word, because I think what it's saying here with misusing God's name is when you misuse his name, when you use it frivolously, when you use it falsely, you're actually destroying something, and what you're destroying is God's reputation.
Yeah, that's true. One of the ways that the commandments are seen, is especially when you get down to the covenant commandments, is that they're all building up on each other. And so taking the name of the Lord in vain can be seen as like an extreme form of lying or of theft, stealing his reputation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, that's an interesting way to think of it. Also, he's the God of creation, right?
Yeah.
And that's who he is.
Mm-hmm.
Like he look at the apostles. Every time they in the New Testament, they go to a new town and they start preaching. Like one of the first things they say, almost always, is, we believe in the God who made heaven and earth. Especially when they're talking to Gentiles, you've got all these gods. Well, the real God is the one who made everything.
Yeah.
And here, if you're using his name in vain, in desolation, it's the opposite of creation. It's destructive.
Oh, yeah. That's a great point. Yeah, I think it's like we saw in Amos when we did our episode on Amos about the famine of hearing word of the Lord. If you don't listen to God, it's like he never spoke. So his words, even though he's giving us words, if you don't listen to them, it's like not having them.
Yeah.
And so when
Amos was, what was our theme there? A famine of hearing the word.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And when you dishonor God's name, right, it means that your words aren't aligned with reality, because he is honorable, right? You have an honorable God.
Mm-hmm.
But when you treat him dishonorably, then you take away from yourself that honorable God. Like
it's basically idolatry again.
Mm-hmm.
Like it doesn't change who God is.
Yeah.
But it changes what's in your heart, what's on the throne in your heart is this dishonorable version of God. Mm-hmm. And that goes back to like a broken record on this, Psalm 32, the great confession psalm. I keep on reminding us that if we look at the root of the word confess, it means say with. Because anything that you confess, what you're saying it with God, anything true, whether you're confessing your sins, well, you're a sinner, that's true. And if you refuse to acknowledge that, God's not, he's not going to turn a blind eye, but also to confess who he is, right? Mm-hmm. So everything we do, it can be thought of that way in confession. And it's just aligning ourselves with reality, with what God says is true.
Yeah. But like God is worthy of honor, but you end up without an honorable God if you don't give that honor to Him. I think what this is why this commandment comes with a
Hmm.
curse,
Yeah.
because uh, it's saying, okay, you're not going to receive mercy, like it says, you won't be held guiltless. Well, I mean, none of us are guiltless, right?
Yeah.
But you won't benefit from the mercy of God because you aren't honoring God, for who He is, which is a God of mercy.
Mhm. Yeah, if you look back on Exodus 20, verse 7 there, that's where it says, you shall not you misuse the name of the Lord your God or take the name of the Lord in vain, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name.
Hmm.
Kind of a terrifying, it's like that terrifying verse about blasphemy against the Spirit being unforgivable.
Yeah, yeah. You don't receive mercy just because you don't represent God rightly as a merciful God.
Mhm.
Hmm. Now, so there are, as we've looked at some of these things here, there are proper and improper ways to use the name of the Lord. So, Caleb, as our historian, why don't you give us some biblical context, take us through some verses that talk about ways God's name is either used rightly or used or misused, and we'll kind of talk about those.
Yeah, so in Exodus 32, right, this is after the commands, after the golden calf, after the people have already grumbled, 1 or 2 hundred times. And, and God's having one of those conversations with Moses about just, why don't we just do away with them? I'll start over with you. So Moses is pleading on the people's behalf here. Exodus 32, 11 through 14. But Moses sought the favor of the Lord his God. Lord, he said, and that's the tetragrammaton, why should your anger burn against your people, from whom you brought out of Egypt, with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say it was with evil intent that he brought them out, to kill them in the mountains and wipe them off the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce anger, relent, and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember your servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to whom you swore by your own self, I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give your descendants all this land I promised them, and it will be their inheritance forever. Then the Lord relented and did not bring on his people the disaster he had threatened.
I mean, I find this passage so interesting because a lot of people are like, "Oh, well, how could Moses make God change his mind?" But
Yeah.
God, I don't think God changed his mind in this instance. I think what it was is he was presenting Moses with this concept that I'm going to destroy the people, for what they're doing down here with this golden calf. And then Moses goes, it's kind of like the same test he did of Abraham, like sacrifice your son to me. And then Abraham goes to do it. And he says, wait, don't.
Mm-hmm.
And God is putting Moses to the test here to say, what does Moses really think about me? And so he tells him, how about if I wipe out all these people? And Moses is like, that would not be good because it wouldn't be in line with who you really are.
Mm-hmm.
You're the God that saved them out of Egypt. And I don't want people to be able to go around saying that you're not. And so I think God's saying, this guy wants to rightly handle my name and
Mm-hmm.
reputation,
Yeah, and he's concerned about how, all the surrounding nations are going to see them elsewhere. He's saying, you have to go with us. You have to go forward with us. If you don't, there's nothing to distinguish us from all the
Yeah.
other peoples in the land.
Yeah, but then you have to think about how they got to this point. Like, how did Moses get to this point? He's standing on Mount Sinai now, arguing, for the greatness of the name of God, and don't let your reputation be sullied, by anything. And if you go back in time and you think about how they got there, like in Exodus 3:13 through 15, it says, Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them?" God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, again, the divine name right there, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name ye shall call me from generation to generation. So, like right here, he tells them to use the name.
Mm-hmm.
Call me by that name.
Yeah.
It's not a prohibition against ever using the name. At first, he's like, tell them that you're coming in the name of Yahweh. And that works. Like the people are open to that. They're like, we look in Exodus 3, 29 through 31 here. Moses and Aaron brought together all the elders of the Israelites, and Aaron told them everything the Lord had said to Moses. He also performed the signs before the people, and they believed. And when they heard that the Lord was concerned about them and had seen their misery, they bowed down and worshiped.
So that's right at the beginning there of Exodus, right? Moses has just come back to Egypt, and initially the people are like, "Oh, thank goodness, God's going to save us."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they're calling on him by the Tetragrammaton here, by his divine name.
Yeah. And that lasts all of 2 chapters.
Yeah. Yeah, you jump over to Exodus 5, and all of a sudden, the Pharaoh takes away their straw and everything, and then you read this.
The Israelite overseers realized they were in trouble when they were told, "You are not to reduce the number of bricks required of you for each day." When they left Pharaoh, they found Moses and Aaron waiting to meet them, and they said, "May the Lord look on you and judge you. You have made us obnoxious to Pharaoh and his officials and have put a sword in their hand to kill us." Moses returned to the Lord and said, "Why, Lord, and why have you brought trouble on this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble on his people, and you have not rescued your people at all."
So he's using the divine name all throughout here. And so ever since I spoke in your name, we've just had trouble, and so there is this roller coaster that they went through. And you see the people saying, the name of the Lord is bad, and Moses saying, your name has caused us trouble. But after it's all over and they get through the Exodus and God saves them, then Moses is on Mount Sinai. He's like, "Hey, we went through all this already.
Mm-hmm.
Like, don't destroy the people now. I mean, we would look silly. You would look silly. Your name would look silly."
Well, this is something I think to keep in mind, especially in our culture with the way it is in today. Ever since we spoke to Pharaoh, to Egypt, who you can fit in anyone there, Babylon, Rome, America, any peoples, any nations, ever since we went and spoke in your name, they brought trouble on us. If we're going to be confessing, like we talked about, aligning ourselves with God's truth, well, the world, which doesn't want to align itself with God's truth, is not going to like that. You simply can't have it both ways, right?
Yeah, we have to have kind of the mindset that the apostles had in Acts 5, verse 41. It says, "The apostles left the Sanhedrin rejoicing because they had been counted worthy of suffering disgrace for the name. Day after day in the temple courts and from house to house, they never stopped teaching and proclaiming the good news that Jesus is the Messiah." So, we have to have that same mindset that when that happens to us, we're going to stay aligned with reality.
Mm-hmm.
And that reality is the truth of God's name.
So I think we kind of established that valid use of his name, right? To call upon him for help, to look to him for our salvation, right? As he said, "This is my name, call upon it." So let's get back to kind of that prohibition. Why is it there, right? What ways can people abuse his name? So in Leviticus 19:12, it says, "Do not swear falsely by my name and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord."
And there's the divine name right at the end.
Now notice again, he could have worded this, like you said, he could have simply said, "Don't use the name of the Lord." There you go. Nothing to worry about. You can't misuse it if you can't use it. So, but he says, "Do not swear falsely by my name." Not necessarily don't swear by my name.
Yeah. Yeah, we have to take it serious. It's a weighty thing. So I mean, if you're not a thoughtful person, then maybe you should just have a prohibition against using God's name, if you're not going to be thoughtful about it. But what this is calling us to is a thoughtful, mindful use of God's name, not swearing falsely, like we hear people say, "I swear to God."
Mm-hmm.
I swear to God, and whenever I hear somebody say that, it always makes me cringe,
Yeah.
I'm like,
Because they're probably not talking about something serious.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's an interesting thing, right? I mean, we've already kind of talked about that juxtaposition that the world has, and that's going to include our own sinful flesh, right? Against wanting to acknowledge God's truth, wanting to acknowledge His reality. Like Jesus talks about, and the Apostle John talks about how much men love the darkness, right? Love to hide our deeds.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of do that in two ways: by pretending they don't exist, or by pretending that they were actually good. Say, well, God wants me to. He wanted me to do that.
Yeah.
Wouldn't God want me to be happy? Why does He want me to stay in my, failing marriage? There's a younger, hotter woman. Doesn't He want me to be happy? Doesn't He want her to be happy? Like, you're saying you're now attributing God to evil.
Yeah.
So there's kind of two ways I think about doing that, and one of them is dragging God's name down into the mud with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, when we were going through the minor prophets, we talked about that, how people were complaining, oh, well, God doesn't judge the evil people, so God approves of evil people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Malachi?
Yeah, it was in our last, Malachi. But, I think if you think about it, if you're going to claim God, like say you're going to call yourself a Christian or a Jew, or you're going to say, I believe in God, and then you go out and act falsely, you're really pulling God's reputation down in the world. It's kind of strange, but God, by telling us His name and by associating Himself with us, He was really saying, I'm wanting to be known by who you are as a people, And so when we misrepresent Him to the world, we're actually destroying His relationship, getting back to that desolating.
Yeah. This is just like the temple, our temple episode, where we said the temple was a place of joy for all people,
right?
For all nations. I mean, we even see Gentiles come into Israel and worship God there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and in the New Testament, of course, that's applied now to the Christian. The Christian is going out to the world because the Gentiles didn't usually want to come in, so we got to go get them. And we're supposed to bring that joy of God out into the world to all people. And it's interesting, too. One of the verses I found as I was preparing for this, just looking for, anywhere where the name of the Lord comes up, when Solomon is preparing to build the temple, this is 2 Chronicles 2, 4, and 5. Now I am about to build a temple for the name of the Lord my God and dedicate it to Him, for burning fragrant incense before Him, for setting out the consecrated bread regularly, for making burnt offerings every morning and evening and on Sabbaths, at the new moons and at the appointed festivals of the Lord our God. This is a lasting ordinance for Israel. Then verse 5, the temple I'm going to build will be great because our God is greater than all other gods. So the temple there He dedicates to the name of the Lord because He's the great God above all other gods.
And where is that temple now?
It's the church.
That temple, that physical temple.
Yes. Yeah.
Because it became a farce. It became ridiculous.
Yeah.
In its
because they profaned it.
Yeah.
Yeah. They were using it in vain.
Yeah. So it got destroyed. This is kind of the idea of like swearing falsely in the name of the Lord, just like where Jeremiah said, well, you can't just say the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, and then go on doing all your detestable things. And God's not going to stand for that kind of thing. So that's kind of like this negative side of it. And then another negative side of things is Exodus 23:13, which says, be careful to do everything I have said to you. Do not invoke the names of other gods. Do not let them be heard on your lips. So I think the second half of this, the second sentence, don't invoke the name of other gods. Like that's like the idolatry that we talked about last episode. Yeah. The second command. And I think, this gets kind of the idea of magical incantations, if I know the name of my God, or I can hold his little figurine in my hand, or I can, go to the temple and stand in front of the idol, or offer things to it, that I can control, like what happens to my crops or the weather and all these other things.
We talked about that, right? Like how these are all the things that Psalm 115. The idols are made by human hands. They can't walk, they can't speak, they're impotent. But then the people go to them for their God. It's really interesting. It's like an inversion of what's happening. What God
Yes.
is warning against here. He's saying, "I'm the real God. I'm honorable. I'm powerful. Don't profane my name. Don't take it in vain, because then you're going to lose it. It's going to degrade. It's going to become worthless the way you're
Yes.
using it. I won't honor it. I won't hold you guiltless."
Mhm.
So like there's this tendency to take it and bring it down. With the idols, it's like the opposite. It's like, you should know I made this out of wood. Like which prophet were we reading there? Jeremiah, where he's saying, they take the other half and make a fire and cook their meat on it. and,
Oh,
then with
yeah.
and then with the first half, they fashion an idol out of wood. And then they end up subjecting themselves to this powerless thing.
I think that was in Isaiah.
It's this weird, like mental inconsistency where we're trying to have control over it, over God, but we know that's not possible. So we end up being controlled by basically nothing, a worthless thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And so magical incantations, I think, is one reason why God doesn't want us to misuse his name. Just because we know what his name is doesn't mean we can say, abracadabra, and he has to do what we say. And that's kind of the whole idea of these idols and temples to pagan gods and things where, we can control the weather and other things. But now the first half of the verse, though, when Caleb was talking about this inversion that's taking place, I think the first half of the verse is really cool because it says, "Be careful to do everything I have said to you." Okay, so you see in that the way things are supposed to be. You do what I say, not the other way around. And then the second half is, you don't go to all these other gods and pretend like you're controlling, the gods or your God, me.
Yeah, don't try to do the same thing to him.
Yeah. And so just because you know his name doesn't mean you can control him.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that both of those are tied up in both halves of this verse, the first sentence and the second sentence. The first sentence, though, has the way things are in reality.
Yeah.
Like, I am above you, and I tell you, and you follow. So,
Yeah, so we're going to read, this might at first glance not seem relevant, but we're going to jump to Matthew 15 here. And think about, if you were with us for the last episode on idolatry, listen to some of the things that Jesus condemns here, and remember what Paul equated with idolatry. I think that you'll start to see that connection, since we're talking about this, using the Lord's name in vain compared to calling on idols. So Matthew 15, 1 through 20. Then some Pharisees and teachers of the law came to Jesus from Jerusalem and asked, "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? They don't wash their hands before they eat." Jesus replied, "And why do you break the command of God for the sake of your tradition?" Great response. For God said, "Honor your father and mother, and anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death." But you say that if anyone declares that what might have been used to help their father or mother is devoted to God, they are not to honor their father or mother with it. Thus you nullify the word of God for the sake of your tradition, you hypocrites. Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. Jesus called the crowd to him and said, "Listen and understand. What goes into someone's mouth does not defile them, but what comes out of their mouth, that is what defiles them." Then the disciples came to him and asked, "Do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this?" It's like, yeah, that was the point. He replied, "Every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be pulled up by the roots. Leave them. They are blind guides. If the blind lead the blind, both will fall into a pit." Peter said, "Explain the parable to us." "Are you still so dull?" Jesus asked them. He's offending everybody. "Don't you see that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and then out of the body? But the things that come out of a person's mouth come from the heart, and these defile them. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander. These are what defile a person, but eating with unwashed hands does not defile them." So I think there are several connections there, right? So we read Paul last week in Ephesians, I think, and somewhere else, talking about how, all these things, sexual immorality, slander, are idolatry. He equates it with idolatry because it's in the heart. And we were drawing that connection between, look, we don't, even our secular culture, they're not making idols out of stone or something and worshiping them. But all of this is still happening internally. That's the way it manifested in the ancient world, but everyone's kind of dropped that. But Paul helped us here, and Jesus is talking about the same stuff, right? That's the idolatry in the heart, and what Jesus says here, right? Whatever, or the things that come out of a person's mouth come from the heart, and these defile them. For out of the heart comes all these idolatrous things. And the connection I made here, I gotta credit Martin Luther again. He was saying speech is the first thing that comes out of the heart. So he saw this command, not to take the name of the Lord in vain, as the first external command, the first thing dealing with something outside, and that speech will be the first way that you start to express what's in your heart, which I think is true, right? Like you don't go from being a hardworking, honest guy to like robbing jewelry stores overnight, but you might start bad mouthing your employer. You might start complaining that other people have it better than you know, and it's coming out of your mouth. And eventually you start stealing some groceries, and maybe, you can maybe keep going down that slippery slope till you really are, committing larger scale robberies. It would be a gradual thing, and it's going to start with the mouth. I mean, think about what James warns us about how hard it is to control the tongue, right? Mm-hmm. So I really think there's something interesting going on there. And that having a proper fear of God, like we've talked about, having this proper respect for his name and who he is, don't even let yourself say something that profanes his name. Then that's going to go a long way in guarding you against doing anything that profanes his name.
Yeah, I mean, he was pretty hard on him when he was saying, like, you worship me in vain.
Yeah.
Their teachings are merely human rules. And that getting back to that same, concept of using the Lord's name in vain too, what you're just not, like, it's not as important to you as your own rules are. I think when I read this Matthew 15, it makes me think, like, your internal and your external realities have to be the same. You can't just, there's no way internally you can be corrupt and not have it come out on the outside.
Yeah.
That's kind of like Psalm 32, what we talked about, where you by keeping silent,
his bones are like decaying and stuff.
Yeah. And you were just the corrosive power of sin. You're groaning all day. So you're not really being silent. You're groaning all day because it's eating you away. Mm-hmm. And I think this is the same thing. Like, there's no way a corrupt heart doesn't show up on the outside. And I think we have to be that serious about the reality of God. We have to be consistent about the reality of God. He's either who he says he is or he isn't. And if he is who he says he is, then when we need to be very serious about how we use his name and how we represent him in the world and his reputation in the world, because it's tied to us and he wants it to be, which is, I guess, amazing to me, that he wants to be represented by me. So I need to be very, thoughtful and pensive about how I conduct myself and how I make my reality, stay in line with his reality.
I mean, some of the most basic teachings, the most basic aspects of a Christian life are centered on God's name. It's really easy for us to gloss over it, especially if we're focused on the externals and not what's happening in the heart. But like baptism is in his name, right? Yeah. Jesus commands us to baptize in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. And prayer, we already talked about the Lord's Prayer. The first thing, when Jesus teaches how to pray, the first thing off his lips, Father, hallowed be thy name. Mm-hmm. Honor his name first and foremost. And then also, I wanted to bring up John 14 here, verses 13 and 14. And I will do whatever you ask in my name, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. You may ask me for anything in my name, and I will do it. Now, that's not, it's out of context. That's a great, health and wealth, prosperity gospel verse. In context, with not taking the name of the Lord in vain, do you think Jesus is like, yeah, if you ask me for a new Bugatti, a private jet or something, not that I have any particular, people in mind, the mega preachers, that's not in vain, but if you're going to ask him for like patience, for faith, for increase in good works and growth in the church and stuff, those are not selfish. That's going to be actually in his name, because that's his will. That's what he's interested in. Yeah. That's how we're commanded to pray. So, baptism, prayer, like the most basic aspects of our Christian life, it's all centered around his name.
Yeah. Well, like I think we mentioned last episode what Augustine of Hippo said, love God and do whatever you please.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like
You can't cheat and say, "Well, I'll just do the whatever I please part," and then I love God. Like if you actually take both halves of that sentence seriously, that has to mean you're doing God's will.
yeah.
Yeah.
What does it mean for God to be real? Like to understand the reality of God. He's not just a concept. Like it just like people say, well, Jesus wasn't just a good teacher of moral principles.
Yeah.
He'd have pithy sayings. He did a really good trick with that Roman coin thing, and I loved that. He really got those guys.
The water and the wine. Yeah.
Yeah. But he's really
performer.
He's really God, And
it's like Herod in the Jesus Christ Superstar,
yeah,
Herod song where he's like, "Oh, could do some magic tricks for us."
Yeah, yeah. And he really is God, and so there are, real concrete realities to God being who He is, and one of those would be that He saves us. That we're secure in Him. If we don't believe He's real, if we don't believe that there are external realities to God, then we won't put our faith in Him because we won't think that it protects us.
Mm-hmm.
But in Scripture, you see things like, Proverbs 18:10, for instance, which says, "The name of the Lord is a fortified tower. The righteous run to it and are safe."
Yeah. Now, I quoted this verse a few weeks ago. I forget which lesson we were in.
I don't remember.
But I was talking about Pastor Niemöller, who was like one of the 7 Lutheran pastors in Germany that remained faithful under the Nazi regime. And of course, he was put on trial for publicly saying things like, Hitler's not God, God is God, ridiculous concepts. And there was he was at like the lowest moment of despair in his cell block before the trial. And the guard that walked him to the trial, which you got to wonder what was going on in that guy's mind, because he's kind of living this double life. We've been talking about this contradiction between his internal and external. But the guard whispers to him, "The name of the Lord is a fortified tower. The righteous run to it and are safe." And that gave him the strength to get through the trial. So that's like a real life application of this, If you can stand up to the Nazis because of this idea, then that's about as real as it gets.
Yeah. Yeah, His name is real. It's more real than the terrors of this world.
It's more real than, I mean, it's going to feel in the moment like most of the German citizens, even if they knew something's wrong with the regime, like they still felt too afraid to speak out, right? Mm-hmm. And yet there's still no Third Reich. They're long gone,
Yeah.
But people are still going to be calling on the name of God forever.
Yeah, and another example of this is Joel 2:32.
"Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. For on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there will be deliverance, as the Lord has said, even among the survivors whom the Lord calls."
So you see the divine name all through that verse.
Yeah, here's a minor prophet calling us back to the commandments.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, you see that the Lord is reality. The name of the Lord is reality itself. Yeah. It has the power to save those who align their reality with His.
Mm-hmm.
So one other thing I wanted to talk about with relationship to the progressive nature of the 10 Commandments, like it starts out and it says, "Have no other gods before me." So we started out saying, okay, there is an organizational principle, by which the world works, and that has to be the one true God. We said, it can't be me, and it can't be Caleb, and it can't be anything else. It's
darn it.
Yeah, it has to be God, and everyone needs to organize around, what God teaches, because He's our creator, and so since He is our true creator, He's the one who gets to be the organizational principle around which we all must order our lives. Now, then you get to the second commandment, as we've presented them, and it says, you have no graven image. Okay, well, what that means is, okay, so the organizational principle is God, but I don't get to make Him up. Like, I don't get, He's God and here, I've just crafted here. This is it, and this is what God is.
Yeah.
You know, and I have created it, but I'm going to say this is the one true God, and we all follow that. You know.
Yeah.
But that
Some
doesn't
random,
that doesn't work, right? It has to be the one true God. And now here with the name, it's the same thing. It's like you can't misuse God's name. I don't get to go out and speak in God's name and say, okay, we all have to organize around God, and it's the one true God in heaven. And by the way, he told me that everybody needs to buy me a jet or whatever, you know, like you were just talking about. You don't get to speak for God. God speaks for himself. Sometimes he does that through a prophet, but he does it in his own name.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and anything that anyone says in the name of the Lord.
The prophets are always reviled in their hometown, remember?
Yeah.
Jeremiah's thrown in a pit and Jesus is run out of Nazareth.
Yeah. Anything that anyone says in the name of the Lord will be proven true by its relationship to reality, because God, like we said, the name of the name of the Lord is reality. God is reality, and you can't speak falsely for God and not suffer for it, like he says. That's what this command says.
Mm-hmm. So our 10 words takeaway,
yeah,
is, and we'll have a negative and a positive. Misusing God's name destroys our relationship with him.
Yeah.
See, that's just 8 words.
Well, restating it positively, trusting in God and his name establishes us as his saved people.
That's 12. So you did it again. You averaged it out to 10 words per takeaway.
I wasn't even trying. I didn't even know. Wow. All right. But trusting in God and his name, like these last couple verses we went to in Proverbs and in Joel, that actually establishes you as a saved person, because you believe in God and in his name. So,
yeah. And it's interesting, there's the concept that to break one command is to break the first command always, or maybe all of the commands at the same time in some way. Because to misuse the name, as we've seen, is really turning the relationship upside down. It's saying that these commands that God says, these commands are given in my name, right? You're to do all these things that I told you to do. It's not the other way around. So we're trying to flip it, put ourselves in charge.
Yeah. We're in charge here.
It's. I think that Augustine quote actually is really handy. It's like I was saying, you can do whatever you please part first, then after that, pretend you love God. Just take his name in vain and tack it on to whatever you want to do anyway.
Yeah. Well, and trusting in God's name, right, is to maintain reality. Like God is in charge, not the other way around. Mm-hmm. So it's a curative as well for our tendency to want to be in charge.
Yeah.
These first 3 commands work all together to say, we aren't in charge. God is.
Yep.
So we understand who God is when we understand who God is and our proper relationship to him, right? Then everything is right in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's what we've come away with today. So he's Caleb and I'm Timothy, and thank you for listening to Bible Discussions on Biblocus, where the Bible intersects with your life. Please consider subscribing to our channel to help support our efforts. All scripture quotations, unless otherwise indicated, are taken from the Holy Bible, New International Version, NIV, copyright by Biblica Inc., used by permission of Zondervan, all rights reserved. This program is copyright 2025 by Timothy Klingerman. God bless all of you.